Well, thank you everybody for being with us this morning or this afternoon or wherever you are. I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished speakers, CBD parties, and Edinburgh process participant to the Edinburgh process webinar for parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. If you don't know me, my name is Jean Lemire. I'm the envoy for climate change, biodiversity, Northern and Arctic affairs for the government of Quebec. You probably, you saw me probably in different CBD meeting, and I will be chairing this session with my funny accent and with the support of John Watt and Sue Campbell from the Scottish government, who will act as moderators. Before we start today's program, I would like to invite our moderators to take us through a few housekeeping arrangements. So John or Sue, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean, and welcome everybody to the webinar today. I just want to remind you of some basic online meeting etiquette and arrangements for this webinar. So if all participants could please switch off their video function, and please remain on mute if you're not talking, and that will help with background noise. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions of our speakers at the end of the presentations. We have around 30 minutes set aside. If you would like to submit your questions through the chat function, you can do that throughout the webinar, and the chair will invite those to be discussed at the discussion session. And during the discussion session, if you could raise your hand if you would like to speak, and that can be found at the bottom of the participants list. Please be aware that we are recording this webinar, and it will become available through YouTube with a link posted to the Scottish Government webinar page that was issued alongside the notification for this webinar. And the Edinburgh process participants will also be able to find the video listed in our Attendify app. So that's really all the housekeeping rules that we wanted to run through. I'll hand back to you, Jean.
Thank you, Sue. We have brought today a great selection of speakers to address you today, to highlight the Edinburgh process outcomes and why, as parties of the CBD, you should take these on board. Firstly, we will hear from Rosanna Cunningham, Scottish Government Cabinet Secretary for Environment, on why the Scottish Government took a leadership role in this process and on the Edinburgh Declaration. Then we will hear from Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, the new appointed CBD Executive Secretary, on how the CBD engaged with the subnational and local governments. And from my friend Basil van Aar, who is co-chair of the open-ended working group on the development of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Finally, we'll hear from Mayor Valérie Plante, the Mayor of Montreal, and ICLEI Global Ambassador for Local Biodiversity, on the Edinburgh process outcome. The Edinburgh process team, Kobe Brand and Ingrid Coetzee, and Sue Campbell and John Watt from the Scottish Government will then take us through some of the more detailed results of the engagement with the subnational and local governments and their ambition for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework and its implementation over the next decade. Before I hand you over to our distinguished speakers, I would like to go through some highlight of the three main aims of the Edinburgh process, of those of you who may not be so familiar. The first aim was to gather the views of the subnational and local governments on the development of the post-2020 framework and feed this back into the open-ended working group process and the CBD bodies via the Edinburgh process report. However, as well as feeding back through normal reporting processes, Many of the over 400 Edinburgh process participants also plan to raise the outcome directly with their national focal point. The second aim is to review the CBD subnational plan of action, which was endorsed by the Conference of Parties in Nagoya, Aichi Prefecture, under decision 10/22, to consider what worked well, where improvements are needed, and how these can be taken forward at COP15 in Kunming. And thirdly, to develop the Edinburgh Declaration, a high-level political declaration outlining subnational and local governments' ambitions for the post-2020 framework and setting out what they can contribute. Well, of course, the Scottish Government has been leading this process over the last year, and it is safe to say that it would not have happened without the tireless support of a really, really wonderful partnership of all organizations that you can see on the screen. From global subnational networks and organizations to national and regional governments and agencies that work on the ground delivering for nature. Without this partnership, the EP could not have been delivered. So we take this opportunity to thank all of our partners in delivering the Edinburgh process for the convention. I would now like to invite our first, our first keynote speaker, Rosanna Cunningham, the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform, to take the floor to set out the Edinburgh Declaration. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jean. I'm really pleased to be speaking to you all today. Scotland was one of the first countries to declare a global climate emergency and to recognise the links between climate change and biodiversity loss. We were the first country to submit a full progress report against the groundbreaking international targets agreed at Aichi, Japan in 2010. And I'm really pleased to acknowledge the continuing contribution and support of Aichi Prefecture in assisting with the development of the Edinburgh process. Subnational governments play a key role in delivering action to address the dual challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. Scotland has set world-leading climate change targets, and our largest city, Glasgow, of course, will host the Climate Change Conference COP26 next year. I was keen that we also adopt a leadership role on biodiversity too, and that is why when the CBD asked if we would consider hosting a workshop on the contribution of subnational, regional and local governments, I jumped at the chance. We've been delighted to lead that engagement as part of the important process to develop the post-2020 global biodiversity framework to be agreed at COP15 next May. Parties to the convention formally agree the global framework and targets for biodiversity, but all levels of government, particularly where responsibilities are completely devolved, as is the case for Scotland, have a central part to play to deliver transformative actions for nature across the coming decade. And that's why the Edinburgh process is so important to ensuring that the voices and views of the subnational constituency are heard and taken into account at every stage of developing the goals, action targets and monitoring framework to be adopted in Kunming. I'm really grateful to the CBD for their willingness to engage the subnational constituency and to our global partners for their partnership in developing the Edinburgh process. Through that process, we've established a new international agreement, the Edinburgh Declaration, which sets out the aims, aspirations and expectations of subnational and local authorities. And it celebrates the progress and commitment that has already been shown and the strong desire to build upon previous relevant decisions endorsed by the Convention. All levels of government, including cities, have a key role in translating global and national strategies into real and tangible local actions. Often the resources to put in place that transformative action for nature, money, people, infrastructure, are directed at those levels of government. And this may not always be recognised nor properly utilised by central governments. Our consultation shows that 60% of devolved parliaments, local authorities, city governments, etc., are not engaged by their central government counterparts when it comes to planning and reporting on biodiversity. If the current global pandemic has shown us anything, it has shown us just how important nature is to the health and well-being of every single person on this planet. So we do have to work together at all levels of government and reach out to the voluntary and private sectors to ensure a green recovery from COVID-19. In Scotland, we are also guided by just transition principles, making sure that our green recovery is fair and that nobody is left behind. And that's another reason why we're taking up leadership on nature and on climate change. A strong post-2020 global biodiversity framework is one that recognises and includes all levels of government and administration in planning, mainstreaming, communicating and raising awareness, in providing finances and building capacity for implementation, in enabling knowledge exchange and sharing best practice. We can put in place actions that deliver against multiple outcomes and work across multilateral environmental agreements to bring positive benefits, for example, to nature, people's health and well-being, and climate change, whilst addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. The Edinburgh Declaration is our call to central government counterparts to take stronger actions and make bolder decisions across the coming decade. The Declaration is now open for signing by all levels, government and non-governmental supporters, and indeed by supportive state parties. It would be remiss of them if they did not grasp this opportunity to recognise their vital role in meeting national targets for biodiversity. The good news from our consultations is that the vast majority of non-central government participants are ready and willing to be involved. And I would urge you to reach out and fully engage with your colleagues. This is how we can realise the Convention's vision for this planet of living in harmony with nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great message with lots of passion, and we need some leadership. So thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for your words and for setting out the Edinburgh Declaration. This is an excellent and very important initiative for the subnational and local governments ahead of COP15 next year. And I hope that it will gather increasing support as we move toward Kunming. Thank you also for recording your intervention, which was relayed to the morning session of the webinar. We heard a lot of good comments, so thank you very much. I understand that you have a very busy schedule and are not able to stay for the whole session, but I'm sure that John and Sue will be able to address any question that might be raised on the declaration.
I could stay for some of the speeches.
Okay, great. Also, for the interest of our participant, translation of the declaration are currently available in Spanish, in French and Portuguese, with Russian, Arabic, German, Chinese, and Japanese translation in preparation. So please keep an eye on the declaration webpage for their availability. The next interventions come from the newly appointed Executive Secretary of the CBD, Ms. Elisabeth Maruma-Mrema. I really appreciate that, you know, it's a very busy time for the CBD, and I'm grateful to Ms. Mrema for being able to join us today. So, Ms. Executive Secretary, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Distinguished Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, I would really like to take this opportunity to join the Scottish Government and through you, Cabinet Secretary, in welcoming the Edinburgh Declaration. And we know that this webinar is on the outcome of the Edinburgh process on the role of subnational, regional, and local governments in the preparation and implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I would like to begin by first congratulating the numerous organizations that have contributed to the success of this consultative process that we all know was originally planned to be convened as a standalone workshop way back in April. We also know, owing to the coronavirus pandemic, that could not be possible. Undoubted, however, the partners in this initiative were able to devise an alternative approach using a series of virtual and online consultations over the many weeks, and the excellent effect, probably surpassing what would have been achieved in a face-to-face workshop. The steps that will be collectively taken in the coming months and years will be critical. Subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities have an important role to play, not only in the development of post-2020 global biodiversity framework, but more importantly, in its implementation. With the current climate, health, and biodiversity crisis, and as demonstrated in the findings of the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, we know that it is not longer possible to wait before making transformative changes. We all have to join forces now and urgently in a whole of society approach. Actors at subnational levels understand that efficient action for biodiversity requires involvement of all stakeholders, including indigenous peoples and local communities, the youth, women, businesses, and other groups of civil society. They also understand the importance of richer integration of planning, policies, and actions for biodiversity through all levels of government. It is my wish to see our parties to the convention and other stakeholders continue to engage with subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities. For they are not only enablers of implementation, but also dynamic actors on the ground who can contribute to mainstreaming, monitoring, reporting, mobilizing resources, education, and awareness raising, just to mention a few in their fields of responsibilities and expertise. I would like again to thank the Scottish Government and all partners to the Edinburgh process for leading these important consultations and for joining forces on the road towards 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Once again, congratulations for the success of this initiative, and looking forward to continue working towards its effective implementation, as will in future also be implementing the Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Executive Secretary, for your message, which clearly set out the strength of subnational and local government in delivering for nature. And it's important because you understand the role that we can play right across the post-2020 framework, from planning to the implementation and monitoring and reporting. I would like to also to thank your team, because you have a great team, and we are, everybody is in great contact with them. I think of Neil Pratt, Oliver Hill, and all the others. So thank you for that opening and the understanding of the role that that we can play. Thank you also for that message that you recorded and that we use in this morning webinar session. We receive, again, lots of very good comments, so thank you for that. So we are thrilled that you will be able to stay and participate in these discussions, so thank you for that as well. Next speaker will be Basil van Havre, whom you may know is one of the co-chairs of the open-ended working group, along with Francis Obwald. The co-chairs have the difficult job of developing the post-2020 global diversity framework, and they have both been very active in participating in our Edinburgh Process information webinars, providing updates and information to our different group on the development of the GBF and on the shifting timetable. Je vais me permettre quelques mots en français. Basile, merci pour cette implication, cette passion qui nous encourage tous à continuer. So, Basile, the floor is yours.
Merci, Jean. Good day to everyone, and it's a pleasure to hear you. Can you hear me well? Good. All right, so I've prepared a few slides giving you an update, and if you can go to the second slide. I want to talk a little bit to give you an idea of what we know and what we don't know about the timeline, the role of the key players, some key recommendation, how we're going to be preparing draft one, some key issues, and then I'll point to a few key points that I think are relevant to you on the updated draft, and then we'll go on to some of the new elements. So next slide. So being an engineer, I cannot spare you from showing some graphs and some arrows. That's the way we are. So we're advancing through the process, and you can see here that we've completed the draft on the document. We had the special session last week on GBO5. We're moving through the thematic and synergies. There may be some work on DSIs. Then we'll be moving on to Substar and SBI. There will be a thematic on ABS at some point, and that enable us to create draft one. And then we will be moving on to open-ended working group 3 that would enable us to create the final draft, and then on to COP15. Jean was saying that we had the difficult task of creating the package. Actually, we don't. You are, together with the parties. We're just trying to facilitate that and enabling that. Next slide, please. When we talked about all of the key players, it's important to keep in mind that each of the bodies have unique and valuable role. For example, Substar is one of those bodies that have a very important role in providing scientific and technical advice, and that should be respected and cherished. On the other end, SBI is providing some also equally important role on the implementation, and those are complementary. So there is some discussion that will take place at Substar and then move on to SBI and vice versa. Yet it is important to note that the negotiation, there is some exclusive role, and one of those is the negotiation that has to take place at open-ended working group. Important to make a point about stakeholders and partners, particularly your group at subnational government. It is a very key part of the negotiation that has been recognized since the COP14 decision, but also in the first meeting of the open-ended working group. And this perspective you're bringing is very important, and the declaration you put forward is very useful. Next slide. Now, coming back to the more mundane recommendation from the second meeting in Rome in February, you've asked us to, the parties have asked us to present an updated draft, and that was done and published on September 1, and we'll go through some highlights today. The Substar has to provide us with some advice, particularly on numerical values, indicators, and baseline information. The SBI will provide us some important indication, and I'll focus some attention on that, on resource mobilization, enabling condition, outreach awareness, and responsibility and transparency. And that will enable us to create the next draft. So next slide. So once again, what you will find in draft number 1, which is the one that is coming next, is the fruit of the discussion at the 2 previous meetings that is done, what is upcoming at Substar and SBI, all the written submission up to 24th, and the new thematic consultation. Next slide. Basically, this is kind of another way of representing the same flow of decision. I think the only new point here is some more details about how the thematics are fitting in Substar and SBI, and how the SBI will be providing both some general advice and language to us in terms of how things should be organized in principle, and then the detail will likely be captured into a separate COP decision. That complete the pattern process, so let's get into a little bit of the detail on the zero draft, and that's just a title slide I've been using. The next slide is providing you with the details of what we're doing. The parties have asked us to combine what was then goal A, B, and C, which is now goal A. They asked us to collapse the sub-goals in what used to be goal B, but it's now goal D. We have a new goals and implementation. We've added some milestones. And basically, it's important to note that the milestones are really a way to ensure that we are making progress and we're able to measure that. So if somebody want to make course correction at the end of the 10-year period and we're not on the way to that vision, then it can be done. On the targets, there was a number of change in the wording, and I liked on some of the change later. What is notable is there is a new targets around species action. You will see that on the target 3. On the tools and solution, there was a lot of merger, rewriting, and reordering for better flow. But what is new, and I'll spend a little bit of time, is section E to H, which is now F to I, which is the update of the full section. Next slide, please. So here, we will be reading that slide and looking at it from right to left, starting with the vision, which is living in harmony with nature. And then basically, you can see that we've now decomposed that into 4 goals. That first goal is about ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity. And under that goals, there is some milestone for 2030 expressed in an increase in the area connectivity and integrity, and some numerical targets around species, abundance, and the threatened ones. Contribution to people will continue to be important, obviously, and what we're trying to do with this framework is to balance the 3 objectives of the convention, and that has been pointed to us very clearly. The second one on contribution of nature contributing to people, third one on benefit sharing, and the last one, which is a new one, about mean of implementation. With there a slight variation on the milestone, you will see that the first one is not really a 2030 milestone, it's 2022 about the means of implementation. Obviously, if we want to get that work done, the needs of implementation needs to be there early. I won't go into the detail of each of the action targets given the time here and the focus of this discussion, but I'll be happy to provide more detail separately, and you can definitely look at the website and get them. Then the first one is definitively one that has remained from the previous, not a huge amount of change. The second one is also the proposed target for protection and conservation with the 30% number between brackets. You will see that in the second one, there was a further elaboration in terms of 10% in the higher level of protection. We got a very clear message that this was not supported at the time of Open and Working Group 2, so it is not there. The third one is around the species recovery and cover all those actions that are not otherwise covered. So we're talking about ex situ, breeding, translocation, and those kind of activities that at times we as wildlife managers have to carry out to recover species. Making harvest sustainable as well as trade and use is the same. Invasive, also refined. Pollution, only change there is we've broken down the numerical elements, one for each of the 3 priority substances. Number 7, the numerical aspect of that has been removed, and I know that there is a lot of discussion going on, but we got a very clear message about that in home. 8, 9 are the same. One is focused on species, the other one on space. We try to clarify the language. Number 10 is more broad. It covers all the other regulating services not covered otherwise, so we use the IPES list. 11 is around health and basically is an elaboration of the one that was there, focusing on access to green and blue space. And then 12 is the same. On the tools and solution, mainstreaming is still there, has been refined. What is now number 15 used to be 18, and another one, I can't remember the number, is a merger and focus on those indirect drivers, including sustainable consumption, people choice, and knowledge. By safety, pretty much the same. Incentive and subsidies was brought together with resource mobilization for obvious links, and are pretty much the same. And then information and the engagement of IPLC, women's, girls, and youth. Around that gray box with means of implementation, enabling condition, and responsibility, transparency is equally important. And I'm going to touch in the next 2 slides on a couple aspects. So next slide, please. Participation, and here you don't see the whole list. I've picked up one that are particularly relevant to your discussion. Participation of all relevant stakeholders, including subnational authorities, and those words are important to us, and we got a really clear message. Partnership, very important. Inclusive and integrative governance. We're talking here about how whole of government is included. We had a little chat before the session was open about how governments that have a good tradition of talking to each other and have a good connection are more effective than others. Engagement of private sector, academic institution, political will, extremely important. And active involvement of subnational government, cities and other local authorities there is absolutely a clear message that resonates with us since the first meeting in Nairobi at Open-Ended Working Group 1. Now, very quickly, next slide on responsibility and transparency. The couple aspects, I did not go into the whole details of all the elements of planning, reporting, and review, but the 2 aspects that I want to leave with you is that notion that the system for transparency and responsibility needs to be integrated with other processes. So what you will be setting up in your own governments in Scotland, in Singapore, in Catalonia, in Quebec, needs to be well integrated with what is happening at the national and global level, and complemented by non-state actors. So we're trying to build, I think what we're telling SBI is build us an open architecture, an architecture that enables others to be well connected to it. So thank you very much. We're moving to the last slide now. I hope this very, very quick overview of the latest has been useful to you. I will be with you for the duration of this, and I'm looking forward to the question, and always remain available. You can contact us through ICLEI or directly. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Basil, for that insightful intervention on the current developments of the framework and the updated timeline that will continue maybe to change a little bit, who knows. Thank you for your passion, Basil. I think it's important, you know, it's really, really appreciated. And the room that you give to the subnational government and local government, it's really, really appreciated. Thank you very much. Now, our final keynote speaker for today is Mayor Valérie Plante, the Mayor of Montreal City in Quebec, in Canada, and the ICLEI Global Ambassador for Local Biodiversity. Unfortunately, Mayor Plante is not able to join this session of the webinar. However, Kobe Brand, who is the Global Director of ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Center, will deliver the intervention on her behalf. Please go ahead, Kobe.
Thank you. Merci, Jean. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here and to address you on behalf of Mayor Valérie Plante. So I'm going to read her speech to you, and thank you for allowing us to be part of this fantastic event this afternoon. From Mayor Valérie Plante, Chair Honourable Cabinet Secretary, distinguished delegates, it is a great pleasure that I address you today as ICLEI Global Ambassador for Local Biodiversity. ICLEI and its Global Cities Biodiversity Centre, CBC, has a proud history of advocacy in the global biodiversity agenda. We have represented the voices of cities and local governments for more than a decade in the CBD and related processes. During this time, the main vehicle for advocating the voice of our constituency has been the successive global biodiversity summits of local and subnational governments, held since CBD COP9 in 2008. These summits were held as official events in parallel to the CBD COPs and have been co-convened by ICLEI, the SCBD, the host governments, and in the recent summits also our key network partners. Each summit resulted in a declaration which was presented to the CBD parties during the plenary session. The 7th summit will be held in Kunming as official parallel event at COP15. Over the past decade, we have also seen the CBD parties respond to the voice of our constituency with the adoption of decisions, consecutive decisions, related to local and subnational governments. Together with our network partners, the European Committee of Regions, the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments, coordinated by Regions 4 for Sustainable Development, and the Government of Quebec, and the group of leading subnational governments towards Aichi biodiversity targets, ICLEI committed at CBD COP14 to respond to the call made in Decision 1434 on the participatory process for the preparation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This commitment was captured in the Sharm el-Sheikh Communiqué for local and subnational action for nature and people, adopted by local and subnational governments, our networks and our partners at the 6th Global Biodiversity Summit on local and subnational governments held at COP14. Following COP14, we developed a roadmap and embarked on a series of events, webinars, and awareness raising and information sharing events and online opportunities for our constituency. This included our series of monthly hosted webinars by the ICLEI CBC and physical events co-hosted by local and subnational governments, ICLEI, our network partners, and the SCBD. The Edinburgh process has been the highlight in our roadmap. ICLEI is proud to be associated with this process as a partner and signatory to the Edinburgh Declaration. ICLEI is convening a high-level political session also at Daring Cities 2020 that will focus on our constituency's ambition for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Daring Cities 2020 is a virtual global forum on climate change for urban leaders tackling the climate emergency, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the green recovery, and will run from 7 to 28 October 2020. The climate and biodiversity crises are two sides of the same coin, and local and subnational governments are critical to solving both. For this reason, the high-level session will challenge cities to be daring enough to not only making ambitious commitments to achieving the global climate agenda, but also to achieving the global biodiversity agenda. We will be daring cities to sign the Edinburgh Declaration. Thank you, and we look forward to continued engagement with the CBD parties on the path towards COP15. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Mayor Plum for a message to this webinar, and to you, Kobe, for delivering the intervention. And let me take a few seconds to thank you also for your great work during all that process with Ingrid. You did a great job, and it's important to underline that. I believe that Ingrid will be able to address any question arising Mayor's plant intervention at our Q&A session. I would now like to hand over to the Edinburgh process team, who will take us through the Edinburgh process outcome in a bit more detail. John of the Scottish Government will begin, and then Ingrid from ICLEI to follow. So John, the floor is yours.
Yep. Thank you, Jean. Yes, we'd now like to take you through the Edinburgh process outcomes in a bit more detail. And normally at this point, I would have shown you a picture of the Edinburgh process partners and our subnational local governments huddled around a table in a breakout group deep in discussion. But of course, it's not been a normal year, and we haven't been huddled around tables discussing the issues, at least not physically. Perhaps virtually we've been doing that. And that disruption and challenges that have been caused by the COVID pandemic has actually allowed us to be more inclusive, more equitable, and to reach a wider number of participants than we would have done if we'd hosted a physical meeting in Edinburgh in April as planned. It's also allowed us to reduce our CO2 emissions and our impact on the planet, whilst achieving an arguably a better outcome than we would have done with a single fixed meeting. And I think that is a lesson we can all take from this process, as we're still challenged by COVID, is that we can make transformative change and we can adapt very quickly. We just need to have the will to do it. The Edinburgh process has been delivered through online information events, a series of thematic webinars on specific issues relevant to the framework and subnational local governments, and through 3 consultations on the zero draft of the post-2020 framework, a renewed plan of action, and of course the Edinburgh Declaration. We have had just over 400 registered participants to the Edinburgh process, mostly from subnational local authorities, but also including academics, NGOs, business organisations, including young people, women and local communities. So we've taken on board the views and have used those inputs to inform the Edinburgh Declaration, which was published in August. And in this part of the webinar, we'll dive in a bit more into a bit more detail. At the start of this process, we held a series of thematic sessions to allow the Edinburgh process participants to have a more detailed discussion on some of the topics that are particularly important at the subnational level. And these, I'll run through just some of the key highlights of these thematic sessions that helped inform the other consultations that we undertook. So in terms of monitoring reporting tools, it was clearly highlighted that in order to comprehensively monitor the post-2020 framework, the framework itself must enable vertical integration and implementations of monitoring tools at all levels so we can capture reporting against the new goals. In terms of linkages between climate change and biodiversity, it was recognised that subnational local governments are already contributing to the bottom-up approach towards the convergence of these 2 agendas, and that it was crucial that states implement and highlight coordinated climate and biodiversity approaches. At the Nature-Based Solutions webinar, it was highlighted that local and subnational governments play a leading and crucial role in delivering nature-based solutions on the ground by adopting environmental legislation locally, providing guidance and implementation at the landscape and local scales, and providing financial and technical support within their jurisdictions. And related to that, it was noted that for resource mobilizations, that subnational local governments are on the front line in taking action on biodiversity, which requires investments not only at the subnational level, but also by national governments. And especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, national governments should support subnational local governments in leveraging finance from additional sources, such as the private sector. When we consulted on the zero drafted framework, the good news was that the high consensus among subnational local governments that the key biodiversity issues that they faced were covered. However, there was concern about the lack of reference to subnational local authorities and an emphasis on vertical integration of the different levels of government, although the reference to the whole of government approach was welcomed. It's particularly important when in some regions, 70% of biodiversity legislation is being implemented at the subnational and local level. One of the key messages was that subnational and local governments should not be considered as just another stakeholder, but their competency in the implementation of the framework should be recognised. So we're pleased to see this strengthened within the next draft of the framework that Basile highlighted. However, there are more areas where links could be more explicit. A recurring theme in the consultation response was a wish to see clearer links between the drivers outlined in the IPBES global assessment, both direct and indirect, and the goals and targets in the framework. And finally, it was highlighted that subnational and local governments are in many cases uniquely placed to implement the framework through mainstreaming and nature-based solutions due to their closer links with stakeholders, including businesses, NGOs, local communities, and indigenous peoples. Whilst the new framework was welcomed, many participants commented that the need to keep the number of goals and targets limited to an overall of around 20 in the zero draft meant that some specificity for sector-based targets was lost. And this was particularly highlighted in the case of fisheries, where the lack of a specific reference, as there is for agriculture, will mean that perhaps the political hooks at the subnational and local level are missing. Respondents welcomed a stronger link between biodiversity and climate change, however felt that there should be a stronger focus on protecting carbon stores and nature-based solutions, and this was clearly highlighted through the two thematic webinars. Most respondents felt that the overall ambition is towards what is needed to set us on the road to recovery. However, much of this will depend on how the final negotiations play out in the lead up to COP. And particularly, it was highlighted that there could be a stronger focus on restoration, given that the next decade is the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, lockdown restrictions resulting economic recession have not been shared equally across society. Similarly, the future impacts of climate change and the loss of nature will not be borne equally by all. It was highlighted interventions that will benefit sectors of society most heavily impacted by climate and nature emergency and the pandemic, for example, improving access to nature, should be prioritised. The monitoring framework needs to allow for the inclusion of indicators that can be used at all levels, including at the subnational and local level. And there was also highlighted need for indicators under participation of subnational and local governments, such as the adoption of local biodiversity action plans and adoption of nature-based solutions. Importantly, our feedback has also shown that despite being willing to contribute, the majority of subnational and local governments are not directly involved in planning and reporting against CBD commitments. This is a significant gap which needs to be addressed if we're really to do things differently in the next decade. And the next two slides will highlight this point. When doing the consultation, we asked respondents how they had been engaged in the post-2020 process, and only 14% highlighted that they had been directly involved through their national focal point. And when we discussed their involvement in terms of developing NBSAPs and national reporting, whilst around 30% of respondents were positively and actively engaged, there were still another 56% of respondents for planning, an additional 68% for national reporting that were willing to participate but hadn't been involved so far. This is an important point to emphasize, as in the new zero draft of framework, there is still a need for more vertical integration in relation to NBSAPs and reporting. There's still only specified that actions, only specifically actions in national government entities does not address the subnational and local level, which is a missed opportunity and an untapped resource, and is an area where perhaps an additional specific reference could be welcome. It's also critical to capture the collective actions of subnational governments, cities and local authorities in measuring the overall implementation of the framework, and these are perhaps not being fully captured in national reporting at the moment, and therefore assessments such as the recently published 5th Global Biodiversity Outlook are not covering the full range of implementation. This lack of integration between the national and subnational levels is a real gap which needs to be addressed in the new framework through tangible actions at those levels in the coming decade. I'll now hand over to Ingrid, who will take you through the next section.
Thank you very much, John. And in my presentation, what I want to do is just focus a bit on the responses that we got from the Edinburgh process around, what's the ambition and looking towards COP15. So I think the important thing to mention here is that one of the objectives of the process was specifically to review the plan of action that had been adopted under Decision 1022 and to see, what we had achieved as all levels of government, and then to also focus on what it was that the constituency of subnational and local governments is asking for vis-a-vis a new decision, but also in the global biodiversity framework looking forward. So I think that if we just look at the next slide, if we look at what the respondents looked like, I mean, the important thing there is to see, yes, it was a very representative group that we had participating in the Edinburgh process, but the majority came from the subnational and local constituency. And so the importance of that breakdown is that when we say that the responses coming from the Edinburgh process reflect the views of our constituency, it's good to know that it is certainly a good representative group, but also that this does come with some level of a mandate, as it were. And I think the other thing is that what was important is that a lot of the, and you can move to the next slide, thanks, John. A lot of the involvement from the subnational and local constituency showed that they had a very good understanding of the Decision 1022, of the plan of action. They'd actually used it. They used it as an informative in planning their own actions, and that although that they felt that this was certainly a valuable document, they indicated the level of achievement, and not only at the national country level, but certainly also the achievements that have been made at the subnational and local level. And this provides a very strong, a very compelling case to build on a Decision 1022 and the plan of action, and to renew it and to make it a lot more ambitious. Something that I think is also important here is just to mention that the need for urgent action at all levels of government was recognized, and this links very well to the sort of underpinning theory of change around the whole of government, which is captured in the global biodiversity framework. Next slide, please. What came out also from our discussions and our consultations is the identification of a clear set of principles in terms of what the local and subnational government consistency would like, constituency would like to see going forward around a dedicated decision. And there are 7 main points to highlight here. A lot of them you will recognize were also reflected in the comments and the responses on around the global biodiversity framework that John has just reported on. And I think the important one to start off with is to emphasize that first and foremost, the group felt that the recognition to subnational and local governments being integral part of government with specific powers and functions, and the competency and the responsibility to take action and make decision as accountable implementers means that this group is not merely stakeholders or observers, they are part of government. And likewise, the role of subnational and local governments in mainstreaming biodiversity needs the similar recognition and support. And we're very pleased to see that through the work of the informal advisory group on mainstreaming, this recognition is coming in very strongly in the long-term approach to mainstreaming as well. Linked to that is the whole point around the importance of vertical integration in NBSAPs. These are important tools to set a plan at the national level in terms of how we're going to implement the new framework. and the role and contribution of the subnational levels of government in the NB-Sept is vital. Other things that were important, and we've talked about it today at length, is the issue of the role that this constituency can play in terms of mobilizing resources, capacity, awareness raising, and then also very important is the point about the ability of local and subnational governments to monitor also what's happening on the ground, whether it is at the city or landscape level, regional level, and to capture that when one reports to the CBD on what's happening at a national level. And the last point that was important that came out of the process was that networks, subnational networks and partners have a role to play in helping and supporting subnational and local governments in accelerating biodiversity action specifically. And last slide, I just want to make a few concluding remarks. John, if you can take me to the next slide, please. That if, I think the important point to note there is that as a constituency, we feel now is the time to raise the ambition. The second point is, that we are part and parcel of government and we're ready to take that responsibility, and indeed have been, but we want to accelerate and take it to the next level. I think that the other thing is that there is a willingness to work with the CBD parties, and we certainly ask from the constituency that there is better communication and support and drawing upon the resources at the subnational and local levels. Infrastructure, knowledge, people, etc. is in place. We're ready to help, and we want to be able to do more and to do better, and working together is important. And that is why we've drawn up the Edinburgh Declaration, encouraging our constituents to sign up to that, and also are seeking a dedicated decision for greater inclusion of subnational cities and local authorities in the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ingrid. I think it's over to me to just follow up on what you've said there. And around the Edinburgh Declaration, we are looking for stepped up support, stepped up action by the subnational constituency and local constituency and cities. And we're also looking for the support of state parties in helping us to enable that stepped up action. And so that's the declaration sets out our commitments for our constituency, but as we can see on the screen here, we also have 4 asks of state parties in helping enable that stepped up action. And the Cabinet Secretary earlier outlined the aims and the purpose of the declaration. And the declaration is now available for signing on the Scottish Government website. And we've put a link at the end of this presentation. And you can also find the declaration just by looking in your favourite search engine and looking for Edinburgh Declaration and Biodiversity, and that should get there. And one of the things we will be doing is taking this declaration for presentation to the 7th Global Biodiversity Summit of local and subnational governments, and we'll be taking it to COP15. And if we just move to the next slide, John. And so as well as the declaration, which, as I said, is already published, there are a couple of other outputs that we would like state parties to be aware of that are coming from the Edinburgh process. And one of those is the Edinburgh process report. And we're in the process of finalising that report to present it in 3 tailored forms for the open-ended working group, for SBSTA and for SBI. And we are also, as Ingrid mentioned, we've also recommendations for an updated plan of action and a draft decision, which is currently being prepared. And we've already talked about the Edinburgh Declaration. And we're planning on taking our outcomes to the various side events that will arise SBI 3 whenever that occurs. And as I've already said, the 7th Summit and COP15. So we really would value your support in supporting these outcomes. So we'll just hand back to Jean at this point, who will explain further about the need for support.
Well, thank you, Sue. There's lots of reason why we should all work together, and if we look at why we should act on the Edinburgh process outcomes, it's important because if we want to achieve transformative change, we really need a whole of government and society approach, and a whole of government and society approach. And this is very important. It's a critical time, and we have to work together. It is clear that, local government is ready to do that. And it's clear also that, in that convention, we have room to express our point of view and to be more involved in decision, So let's work together. That's the main message that I would like to share with you. This is an historical time, and if we want to have success, we have to work all together, at all level of the subnational and local authorities. I think that we can place, actions all together to really, in a way, change our world, and this is what we need, really. So, so let's work together. Let's exchange ideas. Let's share ideas, and let's go to our Q&A questions, so we can share a little bit more together on how we can work all together. So for that part, I think that what we will do is I would like to take questions from state party participants first of all. Then we will open the floor to the subnational authorities after that. Please raise your hand, and when you come into the discussion, please state your name and your organization. On that, I will need the help of John and Sue, our moderators, and we will try to address as many as possible, of the question and issues that are sitting in the chat window. So, John, please start the Q&A session. John, I think your mic is not in. Thank you.
I don't have any hands at the moment. We do have a question in the chat highlighting that subnational governments. We have a question from Dave Barlow, City of Manchester. Is there an opportunity to reinforce the importance of the global framework as a positive part of COVID recovery plans? I think that there's definitely that opportunity that as we discussed this morning, many countries and state parties and subnational governments are looking at how they can actually do either green recovery or actually think about a transition where we really change behavior and the way we act. So I think there's definitely an opportunity for the new framework to be integrated into those plans as we're really thinking how we recover from COVID and build back better. I think Basil has his hand raised as well.
Yes, and that's a very good question. I think the question is not so much how you wait for the GBF to be integrated to the green recovery. The green recovery decisions are made now. They're made by government today as we speak, and they're made by your municipality, your cities, your region, and state and local government. So I think what the challenge we have is we're building the framework, and that framework will come towards the end when the decisions are made. So I would urge you to take on board the principle expressed in the current draft and use them as you build your recovery and plan. There was a very good seminar a couple of weeks ago put together by the Egypt government on green recovery and the GBF. So don't wait for the COP next year. Use what we got in front of you and do for the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil. John, any other questions or comments from the chat room?
I don't have any at the moment. There's a technical question I think Sue's answered. Pete, Richie says, can you say a bit more about the metrics indicators for biodiversity which sub-national actors are using, and if there are common approaches? I think, Ingrid, do you want to come in on that?
Sorry. Yeah, so as far as the metrics indicators are concerned, I think it's a really good question, but it's not an easy one to answer, because a lot of that is going to depend on the local context. What I can say that is ICLEI is developing together with some partners and the CBD is developing what we call a commitment platform that we will host on Cities with Nature, as well as the one that we're developing now at the moment, which is Regions with Nature. And the idea of this platform is to create a dashboard where city and subnational governments can make their own commitments linked to the national commitments that would be captured under the GBF, but within the context of NBSAPs. The metrics that one will use will obviously have to link to what is being set as a national target. And then just to say that there's a lot of work that's being done specifically around indicators through a range of different organizations. One that's also worth mentioning is that within the Singapore, and we talked about this at length this morning, within the Singapore City Biodiversity Index, they're in the process of revising and refining this index. The next version of it is imminent to be released. And a lot of that also sets, although it's a sort of a voluntary assessment process, it is very much science-based, and it's a sort of a bottom-up process that has been developed by Singapore National Parks, but in very close collaboration with the cities that have already used this index, as well as organizations such as the IUCN, ICLEI, and the SCBD and several others. So the short answer is, yes, they are important, but the long answer is that it needs to be contextualized, and this is work in progress, as it were.
Just to add to that, I think there was a call within the consultation process on the zero draft that we ran, of the inclusion in the overall framework of some indicators on kind of a global level indicator on the involvement of subnational local authorities, even something as simple as an indicator on local biodiversity action plans adopted that could somehow, given at the global level, give an overview of how the subnational and local governments are involved in implementing the framework. And I think even if we just had one global level target that included that implementation, obviously when it comes to the national level, there'll be a range of indicators that will be taken to support NBSAPs or national reporting against those the targets within the framework, and those will vary from country to country.
Absolutely, yeah.
Any other question or comments, John?
Basil, you want to come back?
If I can add a point on the previous conversation about indicators, definitely what I see from where I am is a desire for a stronger and more robust planning, reporting, and review mechanism, and that extend all the way to subnational government. So for some it's relatively easy. If you look at the commitment on protected area, conversation are already going in terms of in many federal systems, the authority for that resides at the subnational level, and then it's easy to use the same indicators. In others, it's going to be more complex, and I think it's a reason why it is very important that ICLE get engaged into that conversation on indicators at SEPSTA. And there was a peer review process. SEPSTA will be taking place in early December through to January. And that's going to be very important to have a clear set of indicators that can be used effectively and easily at the subnational level. So I see Ingrid nodding here. And that may be a little bit, you know, we're going beyond rhetoric in terms of having true engagement and accountability, which come with the responsibility, of course. So I realize that, but that's going to be key. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Basila, and I really welcome that. You know, one of the difficulties that we have is that you have to somehow come up with indicators that that speak to so many different, not only regional contexts, but different levels of cities, the big ones, the small ones, the fast growing ones, cities that have a lot of capacity, etc. So it is really a very complicated thing. One of the things that we found that works quite well are process indicators. But having said that, you can't just have process indicators. You need all kinds of indicators as well. But we certainly take up the challenge. Thank you so much.
John, any other questions?
I think Oliver would like to step in from the CBD Secretariat and just address some of the chat that's been going on about in the chat box.
So thank you very much, both Jean and John. It's great to be here participating. My observation is related to the suggestion of Andrea, and there was also a good chat exchange with Paul Dale from the state of Sao Paulo in terms of how we could formulate statements in support of the Edinburgh Declaration or of the process to develop a vertically harmonized framework. And I just want to call attention to two possible elements in that. One is the Cities with Nature platform, which is coming through as a way for cities or groups of cities or groups of subnational governments, such as many of those participating in this Edinburgh process, to submit their commitments alongside the Global Biodiversity Framework targets as they are being formulated. And the other one, of course, is the Kunming, the Sharm to Kunming Action Agenda, which is a place and a site that both the governments of Egypt and China are calling for, and they can certainly receive such statements and pledges. So I just wanted to call attention to those potential ways for us to work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. John, any other questions?
I don't have any other questions at the moment.
Well, I'm going to have one for speakers then. It's very important, I think, to consider also the importance to reach the general public if we want to succeed. So communication will be the key, I think, and it's important to be very aware of that in our communication. It's important to use, you know, terms and references that are touching the public if we want to succeed. I'd like to hear a little bit about that communication aspect from Basil. You went, around. You met with lots of parties and different regions. I would like to hear you a little bit more about the importance of communication in that whole process.
Now, I have to be very careful, knowing that Jean spent most of his career as a media person. So, absolutely. So we could sit together, and all of us were educated, engaged people, and we can come up with the best plan in the world. But if that plan is not embraced by the person in the street, it's only going to be a plan. It becomes reality when it is embraced by everybody. And that is what Jean is speaking about, the need for communication. We have one thing going for us. I was watching very carefully a process that was done in France, where following the Gilets jaunes, they had this kind of public assembly to create a new environment plan, and the government in its wisdom wanted them to focus on climate change. And that assembly of randomly picked people choose to talk about nature. And I think what we get working for us is that everyone can relate to nature, be it the tree under which they sit in a urban park, or those of us that can go canoeing on long trips. So it is going to be everybody's job, and I think what we're going to need, and Oliver will know that, and colleagues in the Secretariat know that very well. We're going to need to have a bit of a campaign, and that's one thing. With the delay we have and the time we have, we have the opportunity to build up a groundswell in terms of action. And I think what we need to pay attention to is engaging people personally to take decision and make change in their life. So this is not something from somebody high up in one of the ivory towers, but it is something that people can do for themselves. And then we have also to tell them that future they will be building, not us, they will be building, is a better future. This is not a sacrifice for some unseeable and untouchable better thing. It is something that's going to make their life and lives of their children much better. So hope I help a little bit.
Well, thank you, Basil, for that. You're pretty good in communication, by the way. So if you need a side job, please apply. John, any other question from our?
Yeah, we have a question from Mohammed Madadi, which is how the subnational governments can participate in planning going forward. I think I can maybe have a first go at answering that one. I think it was I highlighted it in the slides that perhaps there's not enough subnational governments that are actively engaged with their national focal points, and it's something that we've promoted through the Edinburgh process. We've developed, in fact, a national focal point letter template for participants to write to their focal point, to present the outcomes of the Edinburgh process, and to open up that discussion. And I think we know that following the adoption of the framework, there will be a push for countries to adopt new NBSAPs based on the new framework going forward. And I think that will present an opportunity for subnational governments to start now in engaging with the national focal point and becoming involved in, firstly, in the discussion about the negotiation of the new framework and national negotiating stances, but also to open that dialogue in terms of, okay, when we develop a new NBSAP to implement the new framework, how will that look? Will it be vertically integrated? How can subnational governments become involved in that? And that will then lead into the reporting of that framework as well. So I think there's a good opportunity now to be proactive if you're a subnational government in addressing your national focal point and opening that discussion. I don't know if anybody else wants to add.
If not, we can go with the next question, please, John.
Just a quick check. I don't think we have any more questions.
Can I come in with regards to NB subs?
Yes,
Absolutely.
Thank you. An important point has been raised with regards to the role of NB subs for the implementation of post-2020. Indeed, we expect the NB subs to still be used as an important tool for implementation. However, we'll also like to be cautious in the sense that one of the lessons we have learned on the implementation of the Aichi biodiversity targets, which are coming to an end this year, was the delay in beginning implementation as the result of countries taking a step back and reviewing, updating, and developing NB subs first. So for many countries, actually the decade for implementation of the Aichi biodiversity target began after 3-4 years. So much as we are counting 10 years, in actual fact, for many countries was less than 10 years. So we hope that the current NB subs, as they are already provide an adequate mechanism to begin implementation immediately, and let then any review updating process be taken in tandem with implementation, as opposed to taking a step back and deal with the NB subs first and then begin implementation. Then we might end up to the same challenges which we are now learning from the Aichi biodiversity targets. Thank you.
That's a very good point, Elizabeth. Basil, would you like to add a little bit more? Can we do something in the next GBF to be sure that, you know, we will be able to make implementation at the one?
There is many ways. I think if we start broadening our perspective on the planning system, as Elizabeth said, we do have NBSAPs. Those plans are very useful. We're not starting from scratch. But then, as Elizabeth mentioned, it is not about restarting a whole new process. Parties in the COP may choose to have the rapid development of a certain limited planning tool, and then let the bigger update roll out as needed. So there is plenty of opportunity. I saw a question on the chat on how subnational government can be involved in planning. There is many ways. It's difficult for me to respond in the general ways, but in a number of countries, when you look at the implementation of the action, they have to be done by the local government. So the parties to the convention or the national government has the authority to represent the countries in international negotiation, but when it comes back home, it has to work with local partners. And in most cases, that would take the form of a dialogue, a conference, a committee, or whatever. And that's where the discussion takes place on how the goal is apportioned across the countries. Many countries have different circumstances across the land. Some parts may be very rural with light density and wild area. Others are urban with most of their population. So you have to have that dialogue and come up with a plan. Please refer to there was a very important report on the valuation of nature that came out yesterday from McKinsey and Company. And if those people that are walking the boardroom of our decision makers are pitching the value of nature and the value of investing in protecting nature, clearly you'll have a listening ears from many sides of government. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil. We're almost at the end of our discussion. I would like to ask one last question to Basil and Elizabeth. And it can be answered really fast, actually. What is the level of confidence that you have that we will have at the end of all that process, a very ambitious framework to work with? Level of ambitions. and what is your confidence of, you know, something really transformative?
It is a difficult question. I think the first element of the answer is that we've asked the Sept staff to tell us if the targets are enabling reaching the goal. So in a sense, whatever I think about the targets, it does not matter that much. What matters is the advice from our scientific advisors. And if they see any gaps, they should tell us. If they can provide us with advice on the numerical targets, telling us what is the range of the possible in reaching the target, that is what matters. And then putting that in front of the parties, then we will be successful. What I can tell you is I'm confident that we have a process that will enable us to get to the right answer. Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you. Indeed, not an easy question. While I agree also with Basil, but then I will take it a different angle in the sense that in terms of level of ambition, looking at how or assessing at how the debates and discussions on the framework are going on currently and the contributions to it from all angles, Edinburgh Declaration being one of them, I will say ambition out there is very high. And very high, not just from governments, but also from many stakeholders. You can clearly see everybody wants to see a good, smart, global biodiversity framework. And if it's smart with the targets, as the co-chair is saying, I think the level of ambition and the commitment to implement, we can clearly see it now visibly coming up, basing from all the exchanges and writings coming up recently. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, that's bringing us to the end of the Edinburgh process webinar for CBD parties. It was very, very interesting. I hope this has given parties much to consider in the continued development of the post-2020 framework as we move toward the COP15 in Kunming. And I'd like to thank all of our keynote speakers who have been able to join us in this little webinar session. I'd like also to thank them for providing their intervention for the earlier session. Just a reminder that this session has been recorded and will be available for playback via YouTube. If you have any inquiries on the Edinburgh process, please do get in touch with John or Sue at the email address shown here. If you have enjoyed the webinar and want to spread the word of the work that is being done under the Edinburgh process, please do use the hashtag post-2020 Edinburgh. And finally, you can find the Edinburgh Declaration on the link shown here. And on behalf of the Edinburgh process, I hope you have enjoyed that webinar, and I wish you all to remain happy and healthy during this difficult time. In a way, you have all been chosen by history to make a difference for the future, and your contribution, your passion, and your leadership is really, really appreciated. So thank you, everybody, and good luck for the rest of our process. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.